A decade of silence. Unanswered questions. A hope that never truly faded. For one man, the pain of losing his best friend felt eternal. But what happened 10 years later proved the power of love and loyalty. This is the story of a missing German shepherd and the incredible reaction of his owner when they were reunited. Get ready for a heartwarming journey that might just bring tears to your eyes. Ethan Walker was 28 years old when his world changed forever. His German shepherd, Shadow, wasn't just a pet, he was family. From the moment Shadow was a puppy, they were inseparable. Morning runs in the park. Long road trips with the windows down. Quiet evenings by the fire. Every moment, Shadow was there. Shadow wasn't just any dog. He had a presence, a quiet intelligence that was impossible to ignore. He always seemed to know what Ethan was thinking, reacting before Ethan even spoke. It was the kind of connection only a few are lucky enough to experience. Ethan had never wanted a dog at first. But the day he met Shadow, everything changed. Shadow was the last of his litter, the smallest of his siblings. When Ethan crouched down to look at the puppies, only one came forward. A small, black and tan ball of fur with bright amber eyes. Shadow walked right up to him, sat down, and stared. Not wagging, not barking. Just looking. As if he already knew. Ethan chuckled. "You picking me?" The puppy simply tilted his head, as if to say, "Of course." And just like that, Shadow chose him. The years that followed were some of the best of Ethan's life. Shadow grew from a curious puppy into a strong, loyal companion. They trained together, learning each other's routines. They hiked trails, explored new places, spent lazy afternoons just sitting on the porch. Shadow was always there. A protector. A best friend. The kind of dog you don't just own. You trust. No matter where Ethan went, Shadow followed. Until one day, he didn't. It happened on an ordinary evening. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. Ethan had just returned from work, tossing his keys onto the counter. Shadow, like always, was waiting at the gate, tail wagging, ears perked. Ethan smiled, giving him a quick scratch behind the ears. "Be right back, bud." He stepped inside, just for a moment. Maybe 30 seconds. Long enough to put down his bag. To check his phone. Then, he walked back outside. And Shadow was gone. At first, Ethan thought maybe he had wandered off. Shadow had never run away before. Never. His heart pounded as he called his name. No bark. No rustling in the bushes. Just silence. His hands clenched into fists. Shadow was just here. Just here. And now, he wasn't. Ethan searched the yard, the street. His voice echoed into the night. Neighbors peeked out of their windows, shaking their heads. No one had seen anything. Shadow had disappeared. Ethan grabbed his keys, jumped into his truck. Drove every street, every back road, every trail Shadow had ever known. He called his name over and over, his voice growing hoarse. Nothing. It was like Shadow had vanished into thin air. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch, staring into the darkness. Every sound made his heart leap. Every shadow looked like him. But Shadow never came home. And as the sun rose the next morning, Ethan knew. It was a warm summer evening. The kind of night where the air smelled of fresh-cut grass and distant barbecues. The sky was painted in hues of pink and orange, fading into deep purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. Ethan had just returned from work, exhausted but content. The familiar sight of Shadow waiting at the gate, tail wagging in excitement, was the best part of his day. Ethan smiled, giving him a quick pat on the head. "Miss me, buddy?" Shadow let out a low, happy rumble, his tail thumping against the wooden gate. Ethan reached for the latch, unhooking the leash. Shadow always waited patiently, never running off without him. He grabbed the grocery bags from the passenger seat and stepped inside. It was just a moment. Long enough to set the bags on the counter. Long enough to check his phone. Then, he walked back outside. Shadow was gone. At first, Ethan wasn't worried. Maybe Shadow had wandered toward the side yard. Maybe he had followed a squirrel up the driveway. But as he called out, his voice echoed into silence. His heart pounded. He scanned the yard, the driveway. Nothing. His steps quickened as he jogged to the sidewalk, searching both directions. The street was empty. That's when he saw it. The leash. Still lying on the ground, completely still. Not pulled or tangled, just sitting there, untouched. A cold, creeping fear spread through him. Shadow never ran off. Not once in 6 years. He would have never left the yard unless something, or someone, had taken him. Panic set in. Ethan sprinted down the street, his voice rising. Shadow! Shadow! No response. He ran to the neighbor's yard, peering over the fence. The old man next door stepped outside, concerned. Something wrong? My dog, Ethan said, breathless. Have you seen Shadow? The neighbor shook his head. Not since this afternoon. Ethan's chest tightened. He rushed to the next house, then the next. Door after door. Question after question. No one had seen him. The sinking feeling in his stomach turned to something worse. By nightfall, the search had grown desperate. Ethan drove up and down the streets, headlights cutting through the darkness. He pulled over at every flicker of movement, checked behind every fence, called Shadow's name until his throat was raw. Still, nothing. It was like he had vanished into thin air. Ethan barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined Shadow out there, scared, lost, alone. Morning came, and with it, a new mission. By sunrise, posters covered the neighborhood. Street signs. Grocery store bulletin boards. Coffee shop windows. Everywhere Ethan went, Shadow's face looked back at him. A black and tan German shepherd, ears alert, warm amber eyes staring into the camera. Beneath the photo, bold letters. Missing, please help. Ethan called every shelter, every rescue group, every animal control center within a 50-mile radius. German shepherd? The receptionist at a local shelter sounded sympathetic. We'll call if anything comes in. But no calls came. He searched online. Lost pet forums, social media pages, found dog reports. Every night he scrolled through endless pictures, his heart leaping at every German shepherd posted. Each time, he held his breath. Each time, it wasn't Shadow. Days turned into weeks. Ethan didn't stop looking. He followed every lead, no matter how slim. Someone had spotted a dog near the park. He was there within minutes. A stray was seen near the freeway? He spent hours searching the area. Again and again, false hope turned to heartbreak. Friends and family told him to accept reality. Maybe Shadow had been taken. Maybe he had run too far. Maybe he wasn't coming back. Ethan refused to believe it. Shadow was out there. Somewhere. And he wasn't giving up. Shadow was out there. Somewhere. And he wasn't giving up. Months passed. The flyers faded. Torn by wind, washed away by rain. The phone calls slowed. The messages stopped. People moved on. But Ethan never did. Even after a year, he still checked every shelter website, still scrolled through pages of missing dogs. He left Shadow's bed untouched. His toys still in the basket by the door. The leash, that same leash he had unhooked the night Shadow disappeared, still sat by the door. A reminder. A promise. The world moved forward. Ethan did too, at least on the surface. New job. New place. But the ache never left. Some nights he still dreamed about Shadow. The way he'd nudge Ethan's hand when he wanted attention. The weight of his head resting against Ethan's leg. And every morning, he woke up to the same silence. It had been 10 years since Shadow vanished. 10 years of wondering. 10 years of unanswered questions. Then, one quiet morning, the phone rang. An unknown number. Ethan almost ignored it. But something told him to pick up. A voice on the other end. Hi, is this Ethan Walker? He frowned. Yeah. Who's this? A pause. Then, the words that made his blood run cold. This might sound crazy, but we think we found your dog. Silence. Ethan couldn't breathe. His mind refused to believe it. His heart pounded as he gripped the phone. What? The voice explained. A German shepherd had been found, limping, weak, but alive. Picked up by Animal Control 200 miles away. Animal Control had picked him up. No collar. No tags. Just a tired, thin, aging dog with fading black and tan fur and eyes that had seen too much. But when they scanned for a microchip, one name flashed on the screen. Shadow. Ethan's knees nearly gave out. He gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady himself. The words rang in his ears, but they didn't feel real. Shadow. Shadow. The name he had spoken thousands of times, whispered into the silence, shouted into the wind. Now, a stranger was saying it back to him. Are you sure? Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. The woman on the phone hesitated. We need you to come down and see for yourself. Ethan's heart pounded. His hands shook as he reached for his keys. There was no time to think. No time to doubt. Because deep down, he already knew. If there was even a 1% chance, he had to go. The drive was a blur. Hours on the highway, but he barely remembered them. His hands were white-knuckled around the steering wheel, his foot pressing harder on the gas with every passing mile. His mind raced faster. Would Shadow remember him? Would he even recognize him after 10 years? What if it wasn't really him? What if this was just another heartbreak? Ethan couldn't let himself believe it. Not until he saw him with his own eyes. The shelter parking lot was nearly empty when he pulled in. The building was small, nondescript. Just another place where lost animals waited for someone to come back for them. Most of them never did. Ethan sat behind the wheel, his heart hammering. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and stepped out. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant, kibble, and something heavier, something unspoken. A woman at the front desk looked up, recognition flashing across her face. You must be Ethan. He nodded, unable to speak. She gave a small smile. Come with me. They walked down a hallway lined with kennels. Barks and whimpers echoed through the space, but Ethan barely heard them. His pulse pounded in his ears. Every step felt like it took an eternity. Finally, the woman stopped outside a quiet corner kennel. She turned to him, her voice softer now. He's right in here. Ethan stepped forward. His breath caught. Inside, curled up on a thin blanket, was a German shepherd. Thinner. Older. His once strong body now frail. But it was him. The dog lifted his head. Ethan barely managed to whisper. Shadow? A pause. A long, agonizing pause. Then, a flicker of recognition. A soft, broken whimper. Shadow stood. Slow at first, like his legs weren't sure they could hold him. He sniffed the air. Took a step forward. And then, all at once, he ran. Ethan dropped to his knees as 80 pounds of German shepherd crashed into him. Whining, shaking, burying his head against Ethan's chest. Ethan wrapped his arms around him, his fingers tangling in graying fur. Tears streamed down his face. 10 years. A decade apart. But in that moment, it was like no time had passed at all. Ethan laughed and sobbed all at once. Shadow nuzzled into his neck, pressing against him like he was afraid to let go. Ethan held on to him, whispering over and over. I miss you, buddy. I miss you so much. Shelter workers watched in silent amazement, some blinking back their own tears. They had seen hundreds, thousands, of reunions before. But nothing like this. Because this was a miracle. Ethan finally pulled himself together, though his hands still shook as he reached out, gently cradling Shadow's face. How did you survive out there, buddy? He whispered. Shadow just stared back at him, his tail wagging weakly. Ethan turned to the shelter worker beside him, his voice hoarse. What happened? Where did you find him? She shook her head. He was picked up in a field near a highway, over 200 miles from here. Ethan swallowed hard. 200 miles. 10 years. And yet, somehow, Shadow was still here. He was malnourished, dehydrated. The woman continued. But he's tough. And the moment we scanned him, we knew we had to call you. Ethan couldn't believe it. He ran a hand down Shadow's bony frame, feeling the ridges of his ribs beneath his fur. How had he survived? Had he been on his own all these years? Had someone taken him and abandoned him? Had he been searching for Ethan, just as Ethan had been searching for him? He had so many questions. But right now, none of them mattered. Because Shadow was alive. The shelter director cleared her throat, smiling softly. He hasn't stopped wagging his tail since he saw you, she said. Would you like to take him home today? Ethan let out a breathless laugh. Are you kidding? I'm never letting him out of my sight again. Shadow thumped his tail against the floor, as if he understood every word. The shelter staff handed Ethan some paperwork, explaining the medical treatment Shadow had received, fluids, food, antibiotics. He's been through a lot, one worker said. But with care, he should recover well. Ethan nodded, already planning everything. A soft bed. A warm bath. His favorite toys. Shadow was coming home. Where he belonged. The drive back was different. No more racing thoughts. No more empty passenger seat. Ethan glanced over, his chest tightening. Shadow was curled up in the seat beside him, his head resting on Ethan's leg. For the first time in 10 years, he could finally breathe. Back home, Ethan carried Shadow inside. The moment he set him down, Shadow sniffed the air, pausing, taking it all in. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. He remembered. His old bed. The backyard. The familiar walls that had once been his home. And Ethan, always Ethan. That night, Shadow slept beside Ethan again. His breathing is slow, steady. Peaceful. And as Ethan lay there, listening to the quiet rhythm of his best friend's heartbeat, he realized something. Shadow had never truly been lost. He had just been finding his way back. Not every story ends with a reunion. But this one did. Even after 10 years of separation, Shadow found his way home. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who believes in miracles. And if you love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications for more incredible reunions. Some bonds never break. Some hearts never forget. And some dogs will always find their way back home.